Welcome everybody. It's lovely to see so many of you here tonight. Wonderful turnout, and we've got a great treat in store with Mark.
Maybe.
And I'm going to hand over to Danny straight away. He's going to do the introduction to Mark, and looking forward to a lovely talk.
Excellent.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. And good evening, everyone. And thank you to Mark for joining us. Tonight we get a chance to meet the real Mark Pack. You guys probably know Mark Pack from so many emails, newsletters, Facebook posts, tweets. I was convinced when I first heard of Mark there were at least 10 Marks out there, but actually everything is created by just one man. So I think we're very lucky to have you join us tonight. In researching before this evening, I was Googling up Mark Pack. These days you have to Google up. Well, here's the tricky thing. As well as the thousands of posts about the Lib Dems, about policy, about strategic ideas, about how as a party we can move forward, there's also another Mark Pack who is a rapper in the deep south in America.
Definitely not me.
Well, I'm wondering maybe if at the end, over a glass of wine, we can always try and ask Mark to see if he can convert one of the pamphlets into a rap. Author of 101 Ways to Win an Election, author of pamphlets, of chapters of books, and Mark, you want to reference one of the pamphlets this evening, right? I think, and if anyone would like copies of those, we're going to pass around a little list. Please just put your name on, and then Mark can send that through to you afterwards. I was really excited though when you were telling me a bit about your background and how you first got into the Lib Dems, of the first ever election that Mark worked on. Imagine 2 days before the vote. And Mark sort of turns up and says, well, it's all done now, isn't it? Nothing left for us to do.
I've learned the error of my ways since.
And I think in many ways it probably led more get out the votes, or advised more of us on get out the votes than almost anyone in this room. So ladies and gentlemen, I think a warm round of applause to welcome Mark Pack.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for those very kind words, and thank you all for turning up, especially as you've actually had to pay to come and see me. So I feel a little bit the pressure is on me this evening. As Danny mentioned, I'm going to touch a little on a pamphlet that I wrote with our former MP for Cambridge, David Hammond, a couple of years ago. So if you, by all means, do write down your sort of name and email address, bonus points if the email is legible, and I'll very happily send that to everyone afterwards. And I just thought it would be useful to reflect a little bit on what is it that we need to do as a party? What is it that we need to do in the Liberal Democrats to be more successful? And I say that because, you barely have to turn on the evening news or flick through the news headlines in your sort of Twitter timeline, or even those of us a little bit more traditional, look through the news pages of a morning newspaper to see again and again reminders of how important it is and how crucial it is for there to be a more effective and more powerful liberal voice in British politics. And that comes through most clearly, obviously, day by day in the debates over Brexit. Who knows what will happen? Unfortunately, the government doesn't know either. It's a little bit worrying, but who knows what will happen. But also on many other issues, such as issues around immigration or civil liberties, again and again, illiberal, sort of extreme populist voices are very vocal and far more powerful than we would wish. And we really need to have an effective counter to that. So I think that question about what is it that we need to do to be more effective, not just in our own self-interest as a political party, that'd be nice if we're doing better, well, higher in the polls, winning more elections, but also, crucially, in a way, that is a means to an end about how are we a more effective advocate for those causes that we all feel so strongly about. And I guess another extra reason to think about that is obviously with the creation and the launch a few days ago of the independent group. I think any of us who have been involved in a political party for a long time can really only look on with a degree of admiration at anyone, particularly if you're an MP, who takes that step of leaving, the party that has, if you think about somebody like Michael Gapes, political parties, for somebody who's been active in a party as long as many of them have been, a political party is almost a bigger part of your life than, say, the partner you may have been married to for a couple of decades. It's, a huge step for people to take. So we should certainly be able to admire anyone who is willing to take such a difficult step. It's also true to say it's not quite clear what they will end up believing as a group. You may have seen Andrew Marr had a couple of the independent group MPs on his sofa on Sunday morning, and he was asking them questions like, well, what policies are you going to have? And their answers were very much, oh no, Andrew, that's just a very 20th century old-fashioned way of looking at things. It sort of did okay as a bit of a placeholder, and I get the point that they've just done something very big, very dramatic, and they haven't yet worked out all the details, fair enough. But there is a real question about what policies overall are they going to end up supporting? And if you look at the previous voting record of the members of the independent group, some of their votes we can absolutely agree with them on. The fact that they have, across the board, been really staunch supporters of Britain's role in the EU is a really good thing, and we really need to find common ground on that. But Joan Ryan, for example, was chair of the No to AV campaign. And not because she's been a stellar advocate of proportional representation and electoral reform all of her life, and AV just didn't go far enough for her. There are some real questions if you look at their records on political reform, on civil liberties, on a range of other issues, about how much common ground or not we will be able to find with them. But the one thing we can be sure about is the more successful we are, the more powerful we are, the stronger, the larger we are, the more likely it is that however all of those events pan out, they will pan out in a way that we feel more happy with and we feel more comfortable with and better ends up promoting our causes and our values. And who knows whether that involves a very close relationship with the independent group or a more distant one. But the one thing we can be sure about is the better we are doing, the more powerful we are, the more likely those uncertainties are to turn out the way that we would like. So for all of those reasons, I think thinking about, well, how can we be more effective? How can we be more powerful is really important. And in a way, there are two basic elements to a political party being successful. So branding and relevance. And by branding, I mean, what's that basic, almost instinctive reaction people have as to, well, you guys, I hate you, or you're competent, or I really like you, or you're incompetent. What's that instinctive bundle of emotions that people have when they think about a political party? And then the relevance one is well, what, do you actually think, we might win an election? Are we worth bothering paying attention to, etc.? So I'll talk a little bit about each of those in turn. On the branding one, I think there's a sort of a slight misconception. I guess many of you at least, certainly are probably thinking, well, the big problem we face in terms of our brand is that lots of people hate us because of what happened in coalition. Now, it's certainly true that there is a sort of hardcore of people who very much do dislike what we did in coalition. But the interesting thing is when you look at the market research, when you look at the evidence about what the electorate overall think about our time in coalition, the electorate's overall view is much more one of, don't really quite know what you guys did, don't really quite know whether you fought your corner. It's much more one of rather than, I really hate what you did. And that's illustrated by, for example, some research done with YouGov in September 2017, where YouGov asked people, what did they think we were right to go into coalition? And also, if they thought we were wrong to go into coalition, had they forgiven us for it? And only 1 in 5 people, 22%, both said they thought we were wrong to go into coalition and they hadn't forgiven us for it. Now, in amongst that 22%, certainly are some people who used to be colleagues in the party, used to be highly, highly respected, liked fellow activists and members and so on. So I don't want to sort of dismiss that 22% out of hand, but it's also true to say that that is only 1 in 5 people. And it's also true to say that an awful lot of those people are people who would just never vote for us anyway, or maybe would have voted for us once or twice in the aftermath of the Iraq War, where they were never really liberals, never really that keen on the Lib Dems, but hated Tony Blair so much and respected Charles Kennedy's stance on the Iraq War. So the problem that we face is not so much one of, that sort of, oh my goodness, what on earth did you do in 2010 to 15? It's much more that people feel they don't quite understand what we stand for. And there's an interesting contrast here with the SNP. Because the SNP in Scotland, when they initially formed a minority government, it was 4 years of minority government. During those 4 years of minority government, they regularly did deals with the Conservative Party to get their budget through. Now, just reflect on that for a moment. The SNP doing deals with the Conservative Party in Scotland. And that didn't turn out disastrously for the SNP, because in fact, at the end of those 4 years, they won an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament election, something that, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but with a degree of truth, it was always said the Scottish electoral system had been designed specially to stop any one party winning an overall majority. So how did they manage to combine doing deals with the Tories with then having a remarkably good election result? Well, a large part of it was because people felt they really knew what the SNP stood for, and therefore they got that the SNP might make deals in order to try and further their agenda. And if you believe you really know what a party stands for, then you can be much more understanding and even supportive of the idea that that party makes some deals, maybe even a few compromises, in order to try and achieve its overall objective. And so our problem, in a way, in 2010 to 15, was that people didn't have that same sense of what we're really about that people did have about the SNP when it was in minority government. So part of the solution is that we need to campaign much more effectively to tell people what we're about. Now, that might sound obvious, that that's what political campaigning, say, would be about, but I provided evidence of the example of what we need to change a little bit, the humble pothole. Now, potholes are, I think, actually quite a serious issue. If you've ever had, say, a bad back and been in a vehicle that's jarred as it goes over a pothole, if you've ever been an unlucky pedestrian on a wet winter's day, walking along the edge of a pavement and there's a pothole and a car that speeds by, potholes do have a genuine, real effect on people's lives, and getting potholes repaired is worthwhile in itself, and also a classic example about how we can demonstrate the difference that a politician who's campaigning in your community can make to your lives. The thing is, though, you don't have to be liberal, and you don't even really have to be a Democrat to be anti-pothole. And the sad truth is that if you look at, for example, when the BNP used to have some electoral success in the UK, thankfully those days are gone now, but when the BNP, not very many years ago, used to win some council elections and so on, part of their success was going into communities that felt very neglected by the council and the political establishment locally, and picking up issues like potholes and campaigning on them. And hence, you may remember the really weird interviews there were in the media with people who had voted BNP being asked why you voted BNP, and them saying, well, I never knew that they were racist or they had these views. Because you can be virulently anti-pothole without really being liberal or democratic. And just to be absolutely clear, about my anti-pothole sort of bona fide days and other similar local issues, graffiti is obviously one of the other common issues that we very often take up at that local level and campaign against. And there are good substantive reasons to. If you look at the evidence about the linkage, for example, between graffiti and other deterioration in the fabric of the local community and crime rates for more serious crimes, there is a good reason. So street art, lovely, but graffiti, there is a good reason to take graffiti seriously as part of what needs to be tackled to help make communities more successful. And to give you an example of just how virulently anti-graffiti I am in that sense, last year I put in some freedom of information requests to Transport for London, because I had this hunch that TfL have got a lot slower at removing graffiti from bus shelters. And they don't admit this publicly, so if you ask them what their response time is, etc., you keep on getting... But I thought, no, I'm sure, just my experience is that TfL have got worse than me. So I put in some FOI requests to try and to winnow out the truth, and I didn't word them quite right, so I didn't discover the answer to the question that I was after. But I did discover something else along the way, which was that over the previous year, across all of London, so tens of thousands of bus shelters in a city of, 8 million people or so, and plenty more people actually coming in during the day or passing through at some point. So, previous year, across all of London's bus shelters, of all of the reports of graffiti that TfL had received, 26%, just over 1 in 4, had come from me. Now, I admit, therefore, I confess, I am a little bit at the obsessive end when it comes to some of these local issues. And I say that just to make the point, quite genuinely. that sort of local community campaigning on those street level issues is really important. It really makes a difference to people's lives, and it quite rightly is the bedrock of a lot of our campaigning. The problem is, or the limitation to it, is if we rely too much on that campaigning alone as the source of our political support, it means people vote for us because they like us because we're nice and hard-working, but they're not voting for us also because we're the Liberal Democrats. And therefore that sort of support is very prone to, firstly, the problems when the really hard-working local activist falls ill or moves away or gets another job. Or we know that our organisation is quite fragile because it's dependent on a small number of people working phenomenally hard. But it's also quite fragile because when people have a big political issue in their minds, us being the really nice, hard-working people is not quite enough to win over their support. And it's why that, for example, with the SNP, going back to my point earlier, it worked so well for them being in a minority government, even doing deals with the Tories to get the budget through, because people had a real sense of who the SNP were, in a way that we haven't often enough in the past given people a really clear sense of who we are. Now, one of the tiny little silver lining from the European referendum and all of the campaigning over Brexit is that obviously Brexit gives us a really good opportunity to campaign in a way that demonstrates our values. But it's not the only sort of way by which we can do it, and it's not the only way by which we should do it. And so part of the answer to how we become more successful once again as a party, in terms of having that much better brand image in people's minds, is about using our campaigning more often and choosing the topics that we campaign on more often to help demonstrate the values that we believe in. And obviously the way to do that is to pick issues that feel very relevant to people, like Brexit. It's not to send, every voter a free copy of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, although it is out of copyright, so, it's not as practical as you might think necessarily that. But, that's not... We demonstrate our values in a way by campaigning on issues that are more distinctively Lib Dem. And alongside that, of course, that community campaigning, and when it comes closer to polling day, that really strong appeal to tactical votes from other parties are a really important part of the mix. But we need that campaigning based on the values that we hold to be part of the bedrock of more durable future success. So if that's sort of how we address the brand issue, turning sort of to the other part of the equation, the question about relevance. How do we make ourselves feel more relevant to the public? And in a way, the challenge here is partly to do with politics in general. I think one of my favourite opinion poll findings is from April 2017, late April 2017. So a little bit before the 2017 general elections, but well into the election campaign. YouGov carried out a poll. Now, bear in mind, YouGov, like with the other online pollsters, they try quite hard to make their samples representative of the overall electorate and so on. And they know that people who are willing to do online polls are not quite typical of of every person, so they adjust their figures to allow for all of that. But it is a little bit of a struggle for them to do that. So bear in mind, this figure that I'm about to give you, if it is biased in any way, it's biased towards people who are a bit more interested in politics than the average person, because they were actually willing to do a YouGov survey about politics. But even despite that, late April, politics all over the news, Theresa May called the general election and so on, YouGov do this poll, 1 in 5 voters couldn't name the leader of the Tory party. And I say that not to sort of make a point about voters being stupid, because it's not to do with stupidity, it's just to do with not being that interested in politics. There's a whole host of questions you could ask me about, say, popular music or soap operas, where my ignorance would probably make you shudder even more about how on earth can Mark not possibly know that. And that's just because, I choose to spend my time on other things, just like most voters, very sensibly, choose to spend their time interested in other issues. So the relevance issue is partly one about politics in general, but also it's one about the Lib Dems specifically. And we see this particularly frustratingly often on Brexit, when you sort of say, well, okay, who do the media turn to talk about Brexit issues, etc., is because we're not as big as we used to be, people feel, well, actually, maybe that person is more interesting to talk to, or those rebels in the Tory party are more interesting to talk to. Well, we're in a real struggle to make people feel that we're relevant. And of course, also that plays out in the tactical voting arguments as polling day nears, that the less relevant people feel we are, the more likely we are to have our votes tactically squeezed, etc. So how do we make ourselves more relevant? Well, part of that is simply what we can do locally, on the ground, in our own patches. Because the upside to how little attention overall people pay to politics is that it means if we're regularly putting bits of paper through their letterbox, if we're regularly talking to them on the doorstep, if we're regularly popping up in their Facebook newsfeed, actually I was going to say it's not quite that hard. That's not the right phrase, because it is hard. It's a lot of work to do all of those things. But it's very feasible to make that local environment be one where they feel, the Lib Dems are really active and are doing lots of stuff, and I feel like I know what these people are up to, and they are active around here. Because people pay relatively little attention to politics overall, there's a real opportunity for us to make the news bubble in the area where they are one in which we're a really big part of it, because we are communicating much more frequently with them. So part of it is about just what we do in our own patches directly. Part of it also is about what we can all do collectively to help sort of plump up the feathers, as it were. If you imagine the party is a bit like a peacock wanting to show off its tail, how can we sort of strut around to the outside world looking as impressive as possible? And this is where things like council by-elections and recruiting new members to the party are so important, because those are two of the sort of currencies of sort of political relevance. Is how many members different parties have gets talked about quite often. And there was a period not that long ago when Tory membership had particularly dipped, where it looked like we might even be about to overtake the Tories in terms of how many members the party has. Unfortunately, the Tory membership has sort of recovered somewhat, so we're not quite in that position again. But actually recruiting more members is not only useful for a local party, hurrah, you've got an extra member, you've got some extra money, you've got someone else who might come to events, etc., but is a really important part of that overall national story. The more members we have, and if our membership is growing, that is part of, the Lib Dems feel relevant. Also, incidentally, the way party internal finances work is if local party membership is growing, you get more money. Not personally, but the local party gets more money from membership stock. So there's a good immediate direct incentive there. But also council by-elections. Every week, just about, there are a few weeks where there are no council by-elections, but just about every week, there's a set of council contests around the country. And that, again, is a way of demonstrating our relevance if we're doing well in those, if our votes are going up, if we're gaining seats. And that'll be particularly important in the next few weeks and the next few months when the independent group have given us, as it were, a window of opportunity, because they've said they're not initially going to stand candidates, which is probably good, because if they initially did, they might well do quite badly. But it also means we've got the opportunity to demonstrate, look, there is a party here that's gaining votes and gaining seats. And so I mention this in particular because, firstly, that is a real part of the sort of political insider media cycle every week. And it's something, therefore, that we can very directly influence, which is brilliant. But I think it's also probably fair to say, collectively, across the party, we tend to not help as much in council by-elections as we could. And I know you've got one on here, and I hope you feel that people from across London are being good and supportive. But I think it's also fair to say that overall as a party, we could and we should do better. So I partly mention this to emphasise the importance of doing as well as possible in the contest coming up here, but also to think, beyond that, just remember, as future council by-elections occur elsewhere in London or elsewhere within reasonable travel time, part of what you can do to help the party be more successful is helping in those by-elections, because they will help to that weekly test that there is, that the media pays attention to as which party's on the up, which party's on the down. But those are both quite tactical things that I've mentioned in terms of how we become more relevant. There is also a bigger question, which is about being a more effective campaigning movement. Because if you just take a slight step back and imagine you had just walked in tomorrow to a new job with an NGO, a pressure group, a trade union, a think tank, and you were working on maybe the comms team there. And one of your challenges was, for this imaginary think tank, well, look, we want to make ourselves more relevant. How do we get the media to pay more attention to what we think? How do we get our CEO to appear on question time more often? How do we get the world to think that we matter and what we think is important? Well, the assets that we've got are pretty impressive. I mean, we've got 100,000 members. We've got some people in Parliament who can use parliamentary mechanisms to put down questions, to question ministers, to ferret out information. We've got 400, 500 or so campaigning groups all around the country who can do stuff at the weekends, who can do photos they can share on social media, do stuff to get into the local press. If you think of ourselves in that sense as a pressure group, as a campaigning organisation, we've got a huge ability to run campaigns to catch the public's attention and make us feel relevant to the public and to the media. If we think about ourselves not just as a political party that fights elections, but also a campaigning movement that looks for all the different opportunities to campaign for the causes that we believe in. And that may be canvassing in a council by-election. It may be going on a march about Brexit. It may be supporting Tom Brake's campaigns with others to make sure that the next choice over who should appear on a Bank of England banknote properly reflects the diversity of the country. It may be going in and campaigning in a parliamentary by-election, one of which is quite likely in the not too distant future. So it may be some of the stuff that we traditionally think of as campaigning, or some of the stuff that we probably all are used to the idea of being campaigning, but we tend to leave to people outside political parties to do. And if we can be that more effective campaigning movement, then that makes us much more relevant. And therefore it's easier to get the public's attention and to make the public think that yes, these people are worth supporting, these people are worth finding out more about, these people are worth helping. And that's where the party reforms that are up for debate at our spring conference in York in a couple of weeks come in. The heart of them is this idea of creating a registered supporter scheme. And the idea behind creating a registered supporter scheme, in a way, is very simple. It's always been the case that there are lots of people who are willing to help the party, but who, for a variety of reasons, don't want to join the party. And it seems to be that there's almost a semi-golden ratio. I wouldn't quite go as far as calling it a law, but a ratio that comes up again and again when you look at the data, that for about every one member we have, there are two other people who are willing to help, but who don't want to join. And so you've seen this in parliamentary seats, where we've gone on to win them at a general election. Typically, it is about, for every one member, they have another two helpers or volunteers in some way. You see it at the moment with our national campaigning. For every one member we've got, there are another two or three people who back our national campaigns and are happy to hear from us. So there's a huge pool of people out there who, for whatever reason, membership doesn't appeal to them, but they do like us, they do want to help us, they do want to support us. So the idea of creating a registered supporter scheme is to provide a better way of involving them more in the party, and also a better way for us as a party to sort ourselves out. So that, for example, if somebody signs up as a registered supporter on the National Party website and they live here in this area, you get to have the information about them as well, so you can follow up and you can ask them and get them involved locally as well. Or that if somebody is a registered supporter in one part of the country and they move to the other end of the country, that data moves with them and the local party where they moved into gets to hear about them rather than us just dropping out of contact with them. There's all sorts of stuff around just being more efficient and more organised in having a sensible scheme that applies across the party. Obviously, the bit that's perhaps particularly likely to get people's attention, and may well have got your attention, up till this point, about those proposed reforms, is the question of who can stand for leader and who can get to vote in an election for leader. For me, the really big thing is actually just creating a registered supporter scheme, partly because I've been arguing in favour of this since long before it was fashionable in the party. Hopefully my arguments in favour have probably helped make it fashionable in the party, but I've been banging on the drum for this for a good few years now. So for me, that's the really important bit. But obviously those other two elements, are important. And for what it's worth, my own view is that I think there's a lot of merit in allowing non-MPs, who are party members, but somebody who's a party member but not an MP, to stand for party leader if they wish. Essentially because I'm a Liberal. I do find it a bit hard to think of a particular person and circumstance who isn't an MP who I think would be the best choice for leader. But as a Liberal, I just think, we should be very wary about banning something completely. And if a non-MP wants to put their name in the ring, well, we can judge them in the election, and if we think actually they've got, they could do the leader job well, then we vote for them, and if we think they couldn't, then we don't vote for them. I think there is a degree to which, as Liberals, we need to be careful to remember to apply our principles about the outside world to our own activities and think, well, okay, maybe I would vote for that person, maybe I wouldn't, but surely the point is we shouldn't just ban them from standing because we think they might not be able to do the job well. That's the point of the electorate. On the question about who gets to vote for leader, I know the experiences of the Labour Party make people sometimes a little bit nervous of this, thinking about, what does opening up the electorate mean? I'll just sort of mention one key statistic on this, is that if you look at when Jeremy Corbyn won the Labour Party leadership election, the first time he got elected, he won amongst the votes of Labour Party members. So even if Ed Miliband hadn't introduced any of his reforms to open up the Labour Party, even if none of those wider groups of people that Labour let into their process had been able to vote, Jeremy Corbyn would have still won the Labour leadership election. So there's definitely a good case to say that electing Jeremy Corbyn was a mistake by the Labour Party and has caused a lot of problem for them since. But it's worth remembering that is not a consequence of the Labour Party trying to open up. Because had they not opened up at all, just been Labour Party members with a vote, Corbyn still won amongst them. So it is often useful to draw lessons from what has worked or not worked for other parties. But I would just highlight that in this case, that would be a misleading lesson. It would be a mistaken lesson to draw from Labour, because that wasn't the cause of Labour's problems. But as I said, we'll have that debate at the Spring Conference. Very happy, obviously, to discuss those issues more in the Q&A. But just sort of finally to sort of wrap up and to sort of recap, as I said at the beginning, it's really frustratingly obvious every day, if you sort of pay any sort of attention to the news, how important it is for us to be more successful and for us to be a more effective voice for the values that we believe in. I've set out, hopefully, reasonably clearly for you the sort of two key routes to do that, about our overall brand and how people perceive us, and therefore the importance of campaigning on our values, and also how we go about making ourselves more relevant and seem more relevant to the public. Quite a lot of that is about what, say, the party leader might do, or what party HQ should do, or what people over in Westminster should do. But as I hopefully also illustrated on all of those points, there's also things that we all can do in our own local area. So my sort of final sort of closing thought would be that although when we think about some of those issues that most motivate us to think about, this is really why we need a more powerful Liberal Democrat voice, they're often national or international issues. The solution, the way by which we can make ourselves more successful, very much starts with what all of us can do in our own local patches. And therefore, what you do tomorrow, the day after, is absolutely vital to that, because one of the benefits of living in a moderately well-functioning democracy, but a democracy, is the power that we all have is absolutely phenomenal. And it's really crucial that we use that power more often and more successfully in the future. Thank you very much for listening.